Welcome to Conway Hall. This is, I think, the fourth or fifth in our Ethical Matters season. Conway Hall exists to put on talks and discussions like the one you're about to hear. Obviously, like a lot of venues, we've been hit by coronavirus and an almost 100% drop in our income. So if you haven't donated to us already, we will be putting details out towards the end of the talk during the Q&A, and how you could donate to Conway Hall. This feels, so this evening I'm sitting in the backup Conway Hall, my shed. It still feels like afternoon, but this evening's talk is Rachel Louise Snyder speaking on the stories behind the headlines of domestic violence when considering the ethics of life. Obviously, we need to look at the darker parts of life as well. Rachel has worked on the New York Times and other newspapers, and is a novelist as well as a journalist. The book she'll be speaking on this evening, No Visible Bruises, was awarded the J. Anthony Lucas Work in Progress Award. She's an associate professor at the American University, and Rachel lives and is speaking us from this evening, Washington, DC. So do please welcome, in however much away that this sterile environment can allow us, do please welcome Rachel Louise Snyder. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think I have to turn my camera on now. Still getting used to this new way of life. Thank you for having me on today. I got you. Sorry, I couldn't help it. I know it's not Sunday. Not sure what day it is. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm sorry that I couldn't be there live and in person. It's always exciting to me to go to London, but to me, it's very soul infusing that you are still having these kind of events, and it means a lot to me to be there even virtually. So, and I think, I think that what my mission, as it were, right now is really more urgent than it's ever been. So I'm especially grateful to Conway Hall and to my UK publisher Scribe for this opportunity. I'm going to do a little bit of kind of talking and then read just like a couple of little paragraphs of the book. And then I guess we'll open it up to conversations. You'll see me look down every now and again so that I can keep track of my little timepiece. I promise I'm not checking my email. It's always hard to know. I want to talk a little bit about how I came to domestic violence. It is not a natural subject for me. People are always asking me, was I in an abusive marriage and did I escape? No, I did not, which I think is partly how I was able to tell the stories of people who are inside of those situations. I actually have a degree in fiction. My second book, this No Visible Bruises, is my third book. My second book is actually a novel. And it's a strange kind of convolution. Is that a word? I think I just made up that word. That brought me to domestic violence. And in fact, it turned out to be fiction that was the thing that helped me understand domestic violence. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here. When I finished grad school, which was in the long time ago, I started to do journalistic stories around the world. And I did all kinds of stories that were what in the 90s we called women's rights, and what we now rightly understand as human rights, stories of Tibetan women forcibly sterilized by the Chinese government, stories of women gang raped for sport in Cambodia, stories of women imprisoned for love crimes in Kabul, all over the world in about 40 different countries. And what I didn't quite connect at the time I was doing all these stories were the ways in which domestic violence kind of sat behind every single story I covered. Of course, the girl in Romania, the child bride in Romania, is also the victim of her father's violence and then her husband's violence. So much so that I didn't even ask about it, right? I went around the world doing all these stories without even asking about the violence that they were sort of introduced to in their homes as children. And that goes for victims and offenders, victims and abusers, survivors and offenders, whatever term you want to put on it. I didn't realize it, but I believed all these myths around domestic violence that if things were bad enough, victims would just leave, that restraining orders and shelters, refuges, as you call them in the UK, were adequate responses to the problem of domestic violence. That if you were in a domestic violence situation, it was a case of bad luck and bad choices. That violent people had no desire to ever not be violent. I believed all of these myths without even realizing that they were myths. So in 2009, or maybe it was 2010, I had just moved back to America after living abroad for many years. I lived in London for 2 years, and then I lived in Phnom Penh, Cambodia for 6 years. And I was standing on the driveway of a good friend of mine when his sister drove up. And we began talking, you know, he introduced me, talked about what we did, the kind of work we did. She said she worked for a local domestic violence agency in town, and that they had just developed a program to predict domestic violence homicide before it happened by using this series of risk indicators and thereby prevent it. And I was like, hold on. You could predict, not just predicting murder, right? Not just like predicting that someone is going to do something bad abstractly, but that behind closed doors, this person and this person were going to end up in a situation where one or both of them would be dead. And we can predict that. This blew my mind, absolutely blew my mind. I actually ended up like going around with her. It was a Saturday afternoon. This was back when days still meant something, right? This was a Saturday afternoon, and she has to like go to the farmer's market and go to the grocery store and the liquor store. And I'm just following her everywhere, like carrying her bags, taking her notes. My mind is blown. It is an afternoon that would change the course of my life, like the next 10 years of my life. And in fact, I would realize that everything she's telling me connected to my background in fiction. Let me give you a brief little introduction into what I'm talking about here. One of the things you learn when you study fiction is how plot works, right? Plot is just a series of cause and effect events. It's not just an explosion here and then a car crash here and then a bank robbery here, as many of my younger 18-year-old students often understand plot, that it's just a series of actions. No, it's not actions, it's cause and effect. Because character A does this, character B is forced to make a decision that causes her to do this. And because she has made this decision doing this, character A is then forced to do this, and it's an escalation, okay? Keep that in the back of your mind. So Suzanne Dubuis was this woman's name who I met standing on the driveway of her brother. Standing on the brother of her driveway? No. And I learned all kinds of things from her. I learned that guns, which of course is a particular problem in the States, I learned that guns escalate the danger exponentially. I learned that in terms of how we identify dangerousness, strangulation is different than a punch or a slap. I learned that beatings while pregnant are a sign of dangerousness. I learned that biological children in the home who are not the biological kids of the abuser is also a sign of dangerousness, or can be a sign of dangerousness. It's not that any one of these things is predictive alone. It's that they are predictive in a certain constellation and context, right? Unemployment, financial instability, these are all stressors that contribute to dangerousness. So she uses this danger, it's called a danger assessment. She uses this danger assessment or this risk assessment to try and determine what kind of danger any given victim is in. The higher your score on this danger assessment, the higher your potential level of lethality. As she spoke, I began to understand that this is just the way plot works, right? Somebody beats the crap out of their partner. For lack of cohesiveness, I'm going to use gendered terms here with the acknowledgement that anybody can be a victim and anybody can be an abuser. Okay, so guy beats up his girl, girl calls the police. The police come, they give the guy a citation, but they leave the guy in the home. Now the guy's mad. Character A, character B. Certain actions lead to other actions, right? Now the guy's mad. He's got to tell her that he is stronger than the system that she has just called. So now what does he do? He beats her up and maybe he threatens to kill her. This is on the risk assessment. Maybe he beats her up and strangles her, not to the point of fatality, but he strangles her enough to kill her. To scare her, right? This is escalation. This is what we mean when we say cause and effect and escalation. This is how I began to understand that all domestic violence happens on this sort of timeline of a plot. I'm going to illustrate this with a story from my book, the story of a woman named Michelle Monson-Mosier, who lived in Billings, Montana. So Michelle is 14 years old when she meets her future husband, Rocky. He's 10 years older. He looks very young though. And so her parents don't know how old he is when they begin dating. By 15, she's pregnant. Now she lives with her mother, but her parents are divorced, but her father is a mile away and they're very, very close. And so she goes back and forth to each home, but she has more freedom at her dad's house. So she begins to spend more time there and she winds up pregnant. Rocky says they're a family. They should be together now. They're going to have a kid. Her parents think, wait a minute, this is statutory rape. We should call the police on him. And Michelle says what any teenager would say, which is, if you call the police on us, I'm going to take off with him and you will never see me or your grandchild again. So her parents do nothing, right? What parent would do anything differently? We would almost all do the same thing. So she moves into his trailer. Very quickly after she gives birth, she finds that she's pregnant again. She still graduates high school on time. She graduates at 18 years old. In the States, we finish at 18, not 16. And she has 2 kids under the age of 3. And she's still living in the trailer. And her father says, this is ridiculous for a family of 4 to live in a little 1-bedroom trailer on the outskirts of town. So I'm going to build a house and you can rent my house in town from me. And so that's what he does. I'm going to read just a very brief section from the book, just a paragraph on the day that I met her father. His name was Paul Monson, excuse me. I drive my rental car from downtown Billings to a 4-story house far outside of town, perched up on a hill, where the man inside can view anything that might come at him. Telescopic observation of the world outside. Mountains, plains, escape routes to everywhere in Montana and beyond. The man I'm here to see has avoided me for a long time. Passive avoidance. I've come to Billings from my home in Washington, D.C., talked to his daughters, his ex-wife, caseworkers, returned again. I know the town now, some of the police, some of the prosecutors, advocates, hotel workers, even a printer whose wife runs a basement museum dedicated to women. And now finally, on this, maybe my 3rd visit, he's agreed to see me. I talk to a lot of people who don't want to talk to me. People who've murdered their families. People who've nearly been murdered. People who've arrested those murderers. People who've grown up with people who nearly murdered them. Men like Paul Monson are always reluctant to talk. Reluctant to voice the magnitude of what they've lost, because what they've lost skirts the very limits of their imaginations. Now, money was always tight for Michelle and Rocky. Rocky had worked on a seismic crew, but it took him away for weeks at a time, so he quit that job, saying that he didn't want to be away from his family for that long. And he never had regular full-time work again. At one point, Michelle offers to get a job cleaning at a motel behind their house where she can actually walk to it. And if the kids need her, she says she can walk home, she can help them, whatever. Rocky flips out. He absolutely flips out. He begins to scream at her. He tells her no wife of his is going to be sleeping with the customers at this motel. He tells her that he's the man of the house. He calls her his name. He calls her names. He goes and gets her grandfather's hunting rifle, and he lines her up on the couch with the two kids. And he says he's going to kill them all if she ever says that she's going to work again. This is outrageous. She's, of course, freaked out because he's never done this kind of thing before. And he finally goes on a walk to let off steam. Think about that for a minute. Think about going for a walk to let off steam in a moment where there's a global pandemic, and that is not available to you, right? Rocky and Michelle are having this moment long before COVID, and there are people around the world that no longer have this as an option. So Rocky goes on a walk to blow off steam. She calls his parents. His parents come over immediately. Again, something that cannot happen during this current pandemic that we're in. They take the gun. His father takes the gun, says, "Son, what are you doing? You can't be doing this. Crazy." And Rocky's like, I know. I just lost it for a minute. We're so stressed about money, and she needs to take care of the kids. That's what I need her to do. And they calm him down. He promises he'll never do it again. It's all okay. And they leave. What is Michelle left with? She's left with a calmed down situation, sure. But is she allowed to work outside the home? No. Have his parents really solved anything? No. They've just kind of put a Band-Aid on this wound, right? And the message is, I am the boss. This is Rocky's message to Michelle, and she gets it. She never works outside the home, never even offers to work outside the home again. Years go on. She understands that she can't work outside the home, but she eventually convinces him to allow her to go and get classes at the local school, Montana State University. Their daughter, Christy, the firstborn, had always had trouble with her lungs. She was born prematurely. And Michelle says, oh, this will save us a lot of money if I have nursing experience. She tells her sister a slightly different story. She tells her sister that she wants to get a nursing degree so that she can actually get Rocky out of the house and raise the kids, right? And be able to afford to raise them. She never lets on that this is what her ultimate plan is. At the same time, she goes to her father and she tells him that this is her plan. And she says, can I buy the house from you? And so he and his daughter secretly put the house in her name. And her plan is to be able to legally get Rocky out of the house someday. For the rest of his life, Rocky does not know that he lives in a house that does not have his name on it. So during this period, we know that things are getting more violent, that Rocky is making more and more threats. At one point, Michelle brings the kids over to her mother's house and she says, I think that Rocky is having an affair. I'm going to go home and talk to him. If he comes here, do not let him have the kids. Do not give him the children. What is this coded language that she's using? What is she telling us? What she's actually saying, that her mother knows now, but she didn't know at the time, is that Rocky uses these kids as leverage to get what he wants, to get me to do what he wants. Don't go along with it. Michelle is actually reaching out to a system, her family system, beyond her own home. It's like the first time she's ever done this. Her mother, Sally's like, okay. So about an hour goes by. Michelle's other sister, Melanie, is there. Melanie is 6 months pregnant. And Michelle's mother, Sally, sees Rocky pull up in their car. In fact, he squeals the tires, stops in front of their house, barges across the front yard, and she can see his face. It's just this mask of rage, and she's scared because she's never seen him like this before. So she locks the front door, she locks the back door, and she can hear him pounding on the back door. And then she hears him break the glass, and he reaches in and he unlocks the door, and he comes into the house. He leaves blood all down her wall, and she just throws the kids on the couch and throws her body over the kids. She doesn't know what else to do. It all happens in a minute. And he takes Christy, the 7-year-old daughter, throws her over his shoulder, Melanie tries to stop him, the older sister, and he assaults her, in fact, leaves her bruised from her wrist to her shoulder. And he's out the door, and he's in the car with Christy, and he's gone. And he's gone all night. No one knows where he is. Michelle comes over to her mother's house shortly after that. And for the first time ever, she begins to tell her mother about all of these years with Rocky. She says that she's been assaulted many times in front of the children. She says that he doesn't let her have friends over, that he doesn't want the kids to play with anyone else because there'll be a bad influence on the kids, that he controls everything that she does, everyone she speaks to. And by the way, in recent weeks, he's gone and gotten a rattlesnake from the outskirts of town. And he keeps the rattlesnake in a cage in his house and tells Michelle that he's going to put it in bed with her if she gets out of line. This is why my book is called No Visible Bruises, right? Because you don't need visible bruises when you're controlling somebody through a rattlesnake or through the leverage of your children. I want to read one other brief passage now from the book. In November of 2001, Rocky Mosier bought a gun from the Thrifty Nickel, the classified paper where you can buy everything from a ferret to a tractor to a piano. Then he went home where Michelle had just finished feeding the kids dinner. A neighbor saw Rocky peering in the windows. Sometime after, one by one, he shot them. I'm sorry about that. I don't know how to turn it off. He shot them. Michelle, Christy, Kyle, then himself. It was a case that shook the entire state. Michelle was young, 23, her kids 6 and 7, in first and second grade, learning to read, drawing stick people and lollipop trees. Paul Monson found his grandson Kyle slumped on the stairs, Rocky at the bottom, his face all twisted, scribbles on his arms in what looked like magic marker. Michelle's car was there, and for a few minutes, Paul thought maybe she was alive. He ran to the backyard, then the garage. He saw Rocky's Mustang cars, a bag of family videos. Then the police came, and they found Michelle. The night that Michelle was at her mother's house, telling her mother for the first time ever all these things that had happened to her, her mother convinced Michelle to call the police. And the police came, and they looked at the blood on the walls, and they looked at Melanie's bruised arm. They looked at the broken lock on the door, and they said, "What do you want us to do? It's his kid." He was charged with criminal mischief. It turned out he'd been camping all night. In the morning, he came back, and the police arrested him. And he was taken to the local Billings police station, a holding cell. And Michelle's mother, Sally, convinced her to go and file a temporary order of protection, a restraining order. And Michelle did. She wrote out a whole affidavit talking about the abuse that she had endured for years. As she was driving away from the DA's office, she got a call from her mother-in-law, Sarah, from Rocky's mother. Sarah said, "Oh my God, sweetheart, I just learned what happened. This is terrible. What a disgrace. He is out of control. We promise that he is not going to do this again. We promise." He promises that he's not going to do this again. By the way, she tells Michelle, we bailed him out and he's at his brother's house. Michelle freaked out. She turned around, she drove back to the DA's office, and she said, "I want to recant everything. There is no snake. He's never beat me. It's us against you. Leave our family alone. This is a private matter. Stay out of it." And what does the DA do, the district attorney? Barrister, maybe you call him in the UK? She drops the charges. She says, "Well, without a witness, what am I going to do? I can't do anything." 2 months after that is the day that Rocky bought that gun. 2 months. What do we know from this? What can we understand from Michelle's story? we can understand so many important things. First of all, the police, it's obvious to anybody listening to this that the police did not take this seriously. They don't write a report listing all the things he could have been charged with, right? They write a report that says, criminal mischief, right? Michelle had already reached out to Rocky's family, and she knew that that was a system, we'll call that a system, that wasn't going to protect her. How did she know that? She got that message the night that she tried to get a job, right? And they came over and they took the gun, but nothing really happened. She ultimately wasn't able to get a job. How else did she learn it? Well, she reached out to the police, and the police said, what do you want us to charge him with? In fact, the police report was written so poorly that they didn't even get Christy's age right. It said she was 9. In fact, she was 7. Then she goes to the DA's office. The DA could have said, let me reach out to your mom about this. Let me reach out to your sister. Let me do a little bit of snooping. Let me see if I can get a warrant to search the house and find out if there is, in fact, a snake there. The DA didn't need Michelle's affidavit. She didn't need Michelle's cooperation to file charges, right? Here's what he could have been charged with under Montana law. He could have been charged with burglary, unlawful entry, and remaining unlawfully within the house, criminal mischief, the one charge he actually did get, vandalism. He could have been charged with possible kidnapping or violation of a custody order, possibly, non-custodial interference, and he could have been charged with criminal endangerment, which is a felony in the state of Montana, criminal endangerment because of the rattlesnake. So here are system weaknesses. Michelle is dipping her toes in various systems to see if they'll help. Her in-laws can't help. Her own mother can't help. The law enforcement system can't help. The judiciary can't help. And she's getting all these messages, right? So what does she do? She gets the message. She understands this. She goes and she recants. She doesn't recant because the dangerousness is any less. In fact, just the opposite. She recants because she understands that nothing is holding him, not even that jail cell. She understands this intuitively. If she doesn't understand it here in her head, she understands it here in her heart. Because remember, she's got years of living with this guy, right? And the DA just lets it all go. The DA just says, okay, fine. We wash our hands of it. We've got witnesses who are willing to participate. We're not going to be part of this, right? And so Michelle is left with systems that have given her messages one after another, that she's on her own. There are other systems too. The book, I spend the whole first third of the book on Michelle's story and the question of why she didn't just leave. When she went to file for financial aid, for example, at Montana State University, they told her that she wasn't eligible for aid because she didn't have enough tax returns on her own. She was only 19 years old. She'd never worked. And so they said, you have to give us your parents' tax returns if they're claiming you. She said, of course, they're not claiming me. I'm an independent. I'm the mother of 2 myself. And they said, well, then bring us your husbands. She said, I'm not married. They said, well, then go and get married. So the education system makes her embed herself with an abuser that she is actively trying to leave. She also, at another point, went and sought out medical care. She said that Rocky, she believed, was cheating on her, and she was afraid that she had an STD. A sexually transmitted disease. And she went to a doctor. Of course, she did not have an STD. There's no evidence at all that Rocky was cheating on her. And Michelle's family now thinks that this was an excuse that she was trying to make up to kind of come up with a decent reason to leave Rocky that would be acceptable in their small community. That doctor only saw her one time, and we don't know what happened exactly in that one time interaction she had, but we know this. We know that the doctor prescribed her antidepressants. Now, Rocky saw those antidepressants and threw them away and said he wasn't going to allow his wife to be on crazy pills, right? But this is another system weakness. A doctor that is concerned enough to see her one time and give a prescription for antidepressants, but not issue what in the US is called a terrorist-off warning, which is a duty that doctors, psychiatrists, healthcare workers have when someone is a danger to themselves or others, a duty to inform. Also, the DA never interviewed Michelle long enough to say, wait a minute, maybe I can also talk to that doctor, right? So there's all these pieces that are not being put together. And Michelle is left with all these systems and gaps that are failing her. And she does one last thing, which is make an effort to show loyalty. She's essentially negotiating for her life with Rocky. And she loses. Domestic violence is one frame to view the incredible, vast social consequences that we face as a world today. And it's a frame with such vast public consequences. We know that during coronavirus, during COVID, the stats about domestic violence are skyrocketing. In the UK, you have a hotline for abusers. You have web chat, text, and phone calls, right? I spoke to one of the directors of that hotline, and those numbers are skyrocketing. In some cases, they are up 500%. People are reaching out for help, and they're dying. I spoke to someone in Milwaukee, Wisconsin recently who said that numbers of homicides in that one city alone in the US are almost 3 times higher than they were this time last year. We know that the coronavirus is locking people into dangerous situations. But it's not just someone who stands at the receiving end of a punch who is affected by domestic violence. This is one of the primary points of my book, that unless you stand at the receiving end of a punch, you think domestic violence has nothing to do with you. And in fact, it is, as one researcher put it, the gnarled root from which all other violence originates. As a frame, it has such vast public consequences. It intersects all the social issues that we're facing. Here in the States, from mass incarceration, right, 80% of incarcerated men were introduced to violence when they were children in their own homes as either the victims or the witnesses to that violence. When you look at women, that number is more like 92%. It is the leading cause of homelessness for women in this country. From mental health to education to gender equality, you will find domestic violence. Here in the States, you'll also find it in mass shootings. Domestic violence homicide is, in fact, more than half the mass shootings that we have in this country. We just don't frame them that way. It, of course, affects us in lost wages, in incarceration, in court fees, in healthcare, in law enforcement. For every 20 seconds that I've been up here, someone in the US has been assaulted. Around the world today, 137 women will be killed, and those are pre-COVID numbers, pre-COVID. So domestic violence is the story of homelessness. It is the story of gender inequality. It is the story of mass incarcerations and mass shootings and trafficking and sexual assault and foster children and teen dating violence and every story that we are facing in this broken world. One of the things I talk about when I give talks is look at the systems that you are part of. We're all part of systems. We're part of our own family systems. We're part of our community systems. Maybe we're in education. Maybe we're in law enforcement. Maybe we're social scientists. Maybe we're part of cultural systems. Whatever your systems are, maybe we're in religious or clergy systems. Whatever your systems are, that's where you make a difference, right? This book, my book, this is because one of my systems is the media. This is an attempt for me to right one of the wrongs in my systems, right? One of the ways in which our system, my system, has misunderstood and mischaracterized domestic violence for years and years and years. We all belong to political or educational or legislative systems. And what I learned that day, standing in the driveway of my friend Andre and his sister Suzanne, is that my system was failing. Because we need to know what victims can't say. We need to know what they may not know they know. Michelle's family, the DA, the police, they all had different pieces of the system. No one had one broad view. The danger assessment, and you can look it up yourself, dangerassessment.org, the danger assessment attempts to give that view. Had Michelle ever gotten a danger assessment, we would have seen that she was in the highest risk category. I did one on her posthumously. She was in the highest risk category for domestic violence homicide. So we need to understand this context. I'm going to leave you with one final thought. Gandhi, someone we all respect, someone we probably quote over and over. He said many, many things worth quoting, but my favorite quote of his is this: "In a gentle way, you can shake the world." Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, we do have questions based on that. That was an amazing talk. Thank you. The first one I want to read out myself, which is so the person who left themselves anonymous. Their question is it common for adult children to refuse to believe their father has been violent and abusive towards their mother? Is it common for them to get angry with their mother when she tries to tell them?
It's very common. And actually, it very often falls along gender lines. I've sat in on abusers intervention groups, in fact, where the men, and I'm thinking of one in particular, where the men were doing an exercise around their fathers, and there were 7 men in this class, and I think 5 of the 7 had come from abusive homes, but only one of them really called it abuse. And the other ones all kind of made excuses for their father's behavior. Well, you know, my mom was a lot to deal with. Well, my mom got hysterical. Well, if my mother wouldn't have done X, Y, or Z, he wouldn't have been forced to hit her. And I think for some of us, you know, the case of Michelle is so interesting because I don't know that people would necessarily think of how Rocky used the kids as leverage as violence, but it is domestic violence. It is a kind of violence. Or like that snake is, you know, is it non-physical violence? And I think for a lot of us, it's simply being able to identify what is violence that is so difficult. And I think for kids, you know, they love their parents equally. There's no contradiction for me in being able to love someone who's also violent towards you, right? Kids love their parents, even if one of their parents is violent and the other one is not. And that makes it complicated. Love complicates this as a crime.
Thank you, Rachel. Okay, I'm going to ask 2 people to answer questions, one after the other, because I think they're connected. So first, I'm going to go to B. B, I hope you're with us.
Hi, can you hear me?
Hi, B. Can I just tell you, B was my nickname as a kid.
Oh, nice. So I'm a healthcare professional, and I was just wondering if you have any advice on how healthcare professionals can recognize people that we might see a one-off and who might be in a domestic violence situation?
Yeah, I mean, my guess is that you do recognize them all the time, and it's a very difficult situation or a very difficult conversation to have. I know when I go to the doctor, doctors are more and more asking me if I'm safe at home. And then whenever they ask me that, I always laugh and I say, thank God you're asking me that. I love that. That's wonderful. I think the danger assessment, you know, the danger assessment was developed for healthcare workers, and it was developed by a nurse named Jacqueline Campbell at Johns Hopkins University. And that is one tool that if you don't know how to broach the situation, but you suspect it, first of all, I would always, and I'm sure you do this already, I would always separate the person, the patient, from whoever might be there with her. So if she has brought someone with her, I would separate her so that she has freedom to talk. But I would also let her know about the danger assessment and about doing a timeline herself. I think another thing that I have been really advocating for in the States is to try to get emergency rooms to have part of their procedures try to identify victims of traumatic brain injury in the same way that we do with sports injuries or car accident victims. We have that technology already. We just don't use it with domestic violence victims. And the problem is that strangulation is so often a penultimate act before a domestic violence homicide, and victims may not even know if they have been strangled to the point of loss of consciousness, right? And there may not be visible injuries on them, but there are ways. There's a place called the Strangulation Institute in California that does trainings. There are ways to identify that, and it's a cumulative injury, right? And so if someone comes in with a raspy voice, but they're not complaining of, their head hurting or their throat hurting, you might ask them about it. So strangulation is another thing that I think, or traumatic brain injury that healthcare workers need to be screening for, just as a matter of general protocol.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Bea. Going to go to Graham next. Graham, your mic is open.
Hi there, Rachel. I thought your talk was really good. It's excellent, thank you. I really enjoyed it. And your book seems very interesting. I might well buy that. It sounds brilliant. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, cheers.
Thank you.
My question is a bit of a different scenario. Something I'm studying at London Metropolitan University here in London is based upon prostitution in Mexico and the way women are brutally injured and maybe even killed for having been in prostitution. My question to you is, do you think that women that are actually prostitutes would do it again if they got raped for the sake of their living?
That's a difficult question, Graham. The second section of my book is devoted to offenders, abusers. A lot of times when we talk about domestic violence, we only give the perspective of the survivor or the victim, and we don't often give that other perspective. It was really important to me to give both perspectives. And one of the primary narratives in that section is a guy named Jimmy Espinoza, who used to be a pimp and is now running a nonviolent facility in Northern California in San Francisco. And one of the things he openly talks about in the book, and I go into it, is that in order to keep his women in line, the women who worked for him, he would use rape as a weapon. This doesn't exactly answer your question, but I think there are so many other forces at bay that it's a difficult question to answer. Like, would a woman do that if she had another option? Would a woman do that if she had been raped? Would a woman do that if she had been gang raped? When I lived in Cambodia, there was the last story I did there before I moved back to America, and I did it for National Public Radio, was on this social activity called BAUK, B-A-U-K, and it translates to gang rape. And young, relatively wealthy Khmer boys would go, and one of them would hire a prostitute for the night, bring her to a guest house where 12 or 14 of his friends would be waiting, and they would gang rape her. In those instances, women tended not to go back to prostitution. They sought help, but of course,
I think the biggest problem is that because they need it for a living, their money depends upon it, and because they can't get no food, because they can't get nothing for their kids, because they can't get nothing for their family. Even some people that are in family do this type of thing, and I think they're so destitute, they're so in poverty that they go back and they replicate the situation because not because they enjoy it, but because they just simply need to.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think you do what you have to do, especially when there's children involved, especially.
Thank you, Graham.
Thank you, Graham.
Next question to VR. Let's put you on. Hi, VR.
Yes, it's me. Right, thank you so much for your talk. It was really interesting. I work as a psychologist, and I've worked in prison, and I've also worked with victims of trauma. And something I always grapple with is where resources are best placed, whether working with perpetrators or whether working with victims. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are in terms of how to allocate resources so that we can be most effective.
Oh my gosh, you've got to look out for I'm reporting on that really right now for the New Yorker on really offender accountability during coronavirus, when your systems break down, what are you left with, right? I think there's always a tension there. I mean, it took me like 10 years to research this book, and there was always a tension between, victim services and offender accountability. And victim services sort of always won, and I think maybe rightly so. But unless we really get at the roots of violence and try to address why someone is violent, we're always going to be putting Band-Aids on and Band-Aids on and Band-Aids on. And so, I can't give you a percentage like, it should be split 50-50 down the middle, but I do think that as a social science, batterers intervention or abusers intervention has really gotten the shorthand, right? Like there's not very many. You're doing much better in the UK, by the way, than we are here. I mean, you have an actual national certification standard. You have a national hotline for abusers. Like, you have a coercive control law. Please take a desperate American who wants to, live outside her country now. No, I'm kidding, but not really. So I think that you're already devoting more resources to it than we are in the States. But I do think I would like to see more social services and more universities take this on. Social services to try new things, to try to stop violence, and research universities to research what is the most effective.
Thank you.
Good hitchhiking. Thank you, BR. I'm going to put Laura on next.
Hi there, Rachel. It's Laura.
Is that Laura Richards, my friend?
It certainly is. I wouldn't miss one of your lectures for the world. So I'm very pleased to listen to you tonight. Thank you so much for your...
For those of you who may not know, Laura Richards was integral in passing the coercive control law in the UK. So thank you.
Well, that's very kind. And as I always say to all of my learners, that they must read your book. And I tell people that all the time, that your book is seminal and it's really important because it's one of the most up-to-date books that we have currently, and your storytelling abilities are incredible. So thank you so much for your contribution and your ongoing challenges as well that absolutely have to be raised, particularly as we're in COVID and I've been counting the dead women and children here. We've had 22 women murdered, possibly another one from yesterday, and 4 children. And the question, and you'll be familiar with it in a sense, but we know that coercive control correlates significantly with serious harm and femicide. And it's also the context where children are murdered. Now, in those cases, we know they're not first-time offenders. They're all men. And the problem is male violence. And I've been flagging it now very clearly. Every case that happens is male violence. Yet the problem I see across the globe is that violent men are invisible. So in your view, we have to make them visible, but what are your thoughts on how we go about doing that?
Well, Laura, I'm so glad that you asked me such an easy question.
I'm sorry. But I want to pick your brains because right now I'm pushing it in the domestic abuse bill and there's an amendment tabled. So I'd really like to hear your thoughts.
I mean, I think there's a lot, I'm not an advocate, I'm a journalist. And yet, in the last 6 months or so, I suddenly have these ideas of my own. I'm not reporting on other people's ideas. I'm like, hey, why don't we do X, Y, Z? Why don't we do this and that? I mean, America is different than the UK, right? We have like idiots walking around with rocket launchers at sandwich shops, right? So there's a level of just insanity here. Like when we say men's violence is off stage, I'm not totally sure that that's true, at least here in the US, right? Like, I feel like we are reminded of men's violence and men's rage every friggin' day in this country. The problem is we don't have strong systems of accountability. And I don't just mean prison. Like, you cannot have discussions about offender accountability without having discussions of mass incarceration kind of alongside it, because otherwise you just end up in this punitive system that really doesn't help anybody. And it's sort of like what I was saying to VR, like I feel like, I speak to feminists and advocates all over the country, and their focus is on victims, which is as it should be. But I don't think that that is doing anything to solve the problems. And I have seen some incredible offender intervention programs that are not being replicated because nobody is advocating for them. I have recently done interviewed a woman in Milwaukee who runs the ALMA Center, ALMA, and it is incredible what she's doing there. It is unlike anything I've ever seen, and I wish I would have known her before I wrote the book, because she's not in the book at all. There's also work being done internationally on things like taking the abuser out of the home rather than the victim. Put the abuser in a shelter. And I'm not talking about a prison. I'm talking about a shelter. They can still go to work. They can still, do their daily routine, but then they get interventions, right? And this is where social science needs to come in and say, what are the interventions that work? I do not believe that men have some sort of genetic predisposition to violence. In fact, I listened to a fascinating podcast a couple of years ago called Scene on Radio, SCENE, and they devoted their whole second season to men and men's violence. And one of the things that they argued, and this really resonated with me, was that because men are not predisposed to be violent, the systems of violence that they get involved in, i.e. the military, have had to coerce them. And how do they coerce them? Through drugs, through wine, right? Look at how much, I remember my ex-father-in-law, who's British, talked about in World War II, he was a soldier in World War II, and he talked about how much wine they were given to drink. Napoleon gave his soldiers wine, right? The Lord's Army in Uganda got his child soldiers wasted with, acid and all kinds of other things. So I think, there's an argument to be made that nobody is genetically predisposed to violence, that in fact, it is socially and culturally taught. I don't know. I'm not sure I'm answering your question, because I feel like it's such a huge question, but I think for me, I want to acknowledge that that violence is not a natural state of being, and that the patriarchy has not served men very well either, right? Because what happens when a woman is killed? So often men kill themselves. They're not being served by this system of patriarchy either. So let's talk about new systems. Let's talk about new ways of, equality, where there isn't somebody who has to lose out because women are now getting equal status. I think those men who are walking around, this is a long answer, I think those men who are walking around with their stupid rocket launchers in this country think that equality means they have to lose for someone like me to win. But that's not how I see it. That's not how I see equality, the fight for gender equality. That's not how I see feminism. I don't know, Laura, we should just have a glass of wine and a Zoom call and talk and talk and talk.
I would like to do that. Certainly, one of the key things is about the serial perpetrators who just do it over and over and over again. And we know that you're even if you abuse 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different women, you're not likely to go to prison for that. And that's what I would also, the accountability piece, right, has to change too.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And the other thing, I didn't even mention this, but I wrote a story in December for the New Yorker that talked a little bit about self-defense laws, which our self-defense laws come from England's, Middle Ages self-defense of the castle doctrine, right? That a man has a right to defend his castle, and women were part of the ownership of that. You own your castle, you own your cattle. I'm sorry, I keep messing with my hair. It's so annoying. You own your animals, you own your children, whatever. And we have not adjusted that for the modern age. We have not adjusted that to take into account, domestic violence histories. In fact, in the US, many women, when they kill to get out of their abusive situation, are not allowed to use their long decades of domestic violence histories in their own defense. It's disgusting. Canada and Australia have actually rewritten their laws. So I think that's another thing that needs to be advocated for.
I agree. Well, we've just had the Sally Challen's case where the coercive control law was used for the first time.
I'm really sorry to step in, but we do have another couple of questions waiting. Would it be okay if we park your chat? And
sorry.
That's fine. It's a Q&A. There's 3 other people waiting. Rachel, have you got time to answer 3 more questions?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Brilliant. Apologies, Laura Richards. Just got other people waiting. You 2 can chat and drink lots of wine. Okay. 2 people are shy. Let's have a look. So, well, I've got one here from an anonymous attendee asking. You've covered, I think, a little bit of this in the question, in your answers already. One person has asked, what methods from the different systems, courts, police, social services, would you recommend that help prevent domestic violence during coronavirus? As a possible example, domestic violence protection orders, or what other methods would you recommend?
Oh, yeah. I mean, domestic violence during coronavirus is, to me, my mind, different. I mean, the advice I give during this moment is not advice that I would ever normally give, especially as a feminist. I would never say, don't ruffle feathers, back down, stay out of a room where there's only one exit, right? Like this kind of thing it feels very much, and advocates will say this too, it feels very much the kind of advice we were giving 25 years ago. But the fact is, you want to live another day, and you want to live to get out of this coronavirus. And we can't actually be hauling people off to prison or jail where there is rampant, coronavirus in many of these prisons. And so it is a matter of holding it in as much as you can. I do think, again, those hotlines are fantastic to use for both abusers and victims. And victims, if you need to do safety planning, you can actually still do safety planning with an abuser in the house, right? Come up with an excuse to leave the house for a few minutes. Maybe you got a piece of something in the post for the neighbor, or maybe you have to go walk the dog, or whatever you need to do to get 5 minutes alone where you could do some safety planning. When I've been doing research on men's groups here in the States that have been able to continue through Zoom, the abuser intervention groups, we're finding that it's kind of stunning who's showing up, that men are in fact actually showing up. About 80% of men are still showing up to those groups on Zoom, even though they're virtual now. And they're saying that they've had so many other resources cut in their lives, they're grateful to still have this one resource. So things like that give me hope that we can get through this. But by any measure, domestic violence is going to be bad during coronavirus. It's really, really going to be bad. The other thing I would say is, this is the time to reach out to your neighbors that you may not know, right? We can't always reach out to our family. They might be really far away. You can come up with a code word. I know in the UK, or in Spain and France, they have the Mask 19 code word. I actually recommend coming up with your own code word, and then 2 or 3 people that you can rely on, so that if you call them, they'll understand that your code word is like maybe your pet's name or your kid's middle name or something, and they'll call the police for you. I think you should reach out to neighbors at this point and say, I'm here if you need anything. And also let people know about the danger assessment timeline. You can go online. Anybody has access to what those risk indicators are.
Cool. Thank you. Another question that Marcy read out is whether abusers look for certain traits in victims.
There is research on that. I didn't go into that a whole lot in my book because I'm a little wary of it. Like, I don't want to blame the victim kind of, but I mean, certainly in the second section of my book, the guy that I mentioned earlier who was a pimp for a while, Jimmy Espinoza, he talked openly about how he would target women who didn't have fathers, women he knew in the neighborhood, or he would target women who were always out and about with girlfriends because they seemed to have more freedom. And so I do think that there are things like that. There's other commonalities. A big age difference is also very often, you see big age differences, like with Rocky and Michelle, there was a 10-year age difference. You see very short courtships, right? That kind of intense love very quickly. Morbid jealousy very quickly is another kind of red flag to me. So there are a number of things like that that are I would call them red flags.
Brilliant, thank you for that. I've got another question here from Judith. Judith's going to open up your mic now, and
Hi, Rachel, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hi, Judith.
Brilliant. How many times have you said that over the last couple of weeks? Thank you so much for your talk. Really, really interesting. I think the first thing I'll do when I get off this is order your book. In the meantime, though, I wondered, is there a particular country in the world that stands out to you in terms of dealing with domestic violence and supporting victims? I live in Northern Ireland part of the time, London the other part of the time. Whilst I think the UK is better than some, I think it's maybe worse than others, and it's not always the easiest to get things like non-molestation orders. So yeah, I wondered, is there a country in the world that you think stands out?
I mean, I think Ireland has made some improvements in recent years. I think they've passed some legislation and done trainings and things like that. I have a particular love of Ireland because my grandmother was from Killarney. So shout out to the Irish there. But I think Finland, Denmark, and Iceland, right? It's not any surprise that the countries that are ruled by women have stronger protections for women in them. Countries where equality has really been legislated, right? Not just pushed by social movements. And this is the thing I guess that gives me hope, is that legislation always follows social movements. So the more we advocate for this, I think the closer we move ourselves, or the closer we kind of move the dial. But I do look at countries like Iceland in particular, although there is still domestic violence in these countries, right? But they do a good job of legislating. Iceland, Denmark, Finland, Germany, I think probably New Zealand, although I don't know about minority communities in New Zealand as much, so I'm not sure about that country. But I think they all have done really remarkable things. There's other countries, of course, that are going completely backwards, like Russia, for example, or South Africa, which has seen really, really alarming rise in domestic violence, homicide, and domestic violence. There's a lot of countries where we just seem to be moving backwards.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith.
Thank you. I think that's all we have time for this evening. Apologies to the other people who have questions. I'll say thank you very much for a brilliant talk. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you so much for having me. I wish I could be there in person.
Yeah, we absolutely. Hopefully another time.
Yes.
Thank you everyone for attending. Obviously Rachel's book has been mentioned. Do please get hold of a copy. It's an amazing read. So thank you. Imagine applause.
And thank you to Conway Hall.
Thank you. Speaking of Conway Hall, if you haven't given us a small donation, do please for this talk. We're not getting any income at the moment, and it's our mission to put on talks like this. So I'm going to put a slide up in a minute with details. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you to the audience. And check out our website for other talks that are up and coming. Take care out there. Thank you very much, everyone.